Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Ernst van Zyl, who is also known online as Conscious Caracal. It's a African cat. He himself is an Afrikaner and I don't know how many generations, but his family dates back to the 1600s on the so-called Dark Continent, when it was still known from the European perspective as the Dark Continent. And in this conversation, we talk about the history of his people, the Afrikaners, their landing on the southern tip of Africa, and their wars with the British, and then their current state in South Africa. I found Ernst's story of the Afrikaners to be a handy introduction to that very complex history. You can find links to his work down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Ernst van Zyl. So where does your family hail from? How long have you been in that country? Or were you guys original?
Yeah, well, I always tell people one of the most fascinating questions you can ask a South African is like, how did your family get here? What's your family's story? Um, Luckily, I grew up in a household with a father, particularly that is very into genealogy or family history, but it's actually quite not quite that unique. It's something that's among Afrikaners, at least in my experience, something that's quite common where Afrikaner families keep track to the best of their ability of where their family came from and the family history up until that point. So therefore, I'm very blessed and privileged to have that knowledge of where my family comes from and at least the basic knowledge of my family's history since they've landed here in South Africa. So my first ancestor came to South Africa in 1688. He was a French Huguenot. So that's before America was a country, long before America was a country. And yeah, I'm ninth generation of my family here at the
Wow.
southern tip of Africa. But I'm also, if you look into the different family trees and roots that intersect to create me, it's pretty much the typical Afrikaner genealogical story. I mean, I'm a mixture between French, German, Dutch, and Scottish, and a little bit of, I think if I last time I checked, a little bit of
Hmm.
Belgian as well there. And that's the typical Afrikaner mixture as well as that West European, but particularly Dutch, German, French, and a little bit of British or UK, that area influence. That's the type of
Mhm.
story that you'll get from almost any Afrikaner that you ask, what is your family's history? It will always be from those types of streams. Doesn't mean there aren't Afrikaners that have a completely different heritage. I know Afrikaners that have Hungarian heritage, some of them who have Swiss heritage, Norse heritage. But at the same time, those three streams, but particularly the Germanic streams of
Yeah.
German, Dutch, and French, well, not French aren't Germanic, but anyway, those three streams are the main influences on the Afrikaner culture where
To
our
the best of
ancestors
your
come from.
ability, what did your first ancestor find when he landed in South Africa?
He was the head gardener within the castle that the Dutch East India Company had set up. Well, gardener is maybe a soft word. He was basically a farmer, providing the he wasn't planting
Hmm.
flowers, let me put it that way. But at the same time, he arrived here finding pretty much nothing, finding a but rudimentary settlement, finding the castle was already
Yeah.
constructed at the time, and this ancestor particularly. So there's two ancestors that are very important around this time for me. The one is my French Huguenot ancestor, who's technically the first Paul Roux. He came here in 1688, and then there's my surname ancestor, Willem van Zyl, which is still my surname. He came here to South Africa in 1694, and I actually have a lot more knowledge about him. But I mean, he was the main gardener there at the castle, but had a fascinating life. Rebelled against the governor of the Cape. Fled into the mountains with his with his band of
Oh,
rebels and
really?
hid there in the caves. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, everyone has that story if you ask them about their ancestors in South Africa. They all had fascinating stories. They
Yeah.
weren't just boring people. They lived in a time when they were
Yeah.
doing just cinematic
Yeah.
things, if you
Well,
can
why
put it
why
that way.
is rebellion just
So
kind of
yeah,
a
that's
part and parcel of the history of your country, of your nation?
I think it's part and parcel, particularly of the
Okay.
history of the Afrikaners, but also in some of the other groups here at the southern tip of Africa as well. But the Afrikaners have always just been notoriously skeptical of the authority, very individualistic, even though not individualistic in the sense that we see it today in modern times, where there's still the collective or very strong cooperative nature
Yeah.
of family units, communities sticking together, but also a strong individual sense. During the Anglo-Boer War, the joke was always that every Boer soldier was his own general, and today it's still very much there's very
Well,
much
how did
still
that work out
that
for the
element.
Boers to have
So when
so
it comes
many
to
generals?
particularly
Too many cooks?
well, that's what makes the Anglo-Boer War such a fascinating case study because it's the case study of two diametrically opposed approaches or forces meeting each other. On the one side, you have the highly centralized, almost to a fault centralized British military, and on the other side, you have the highly decentralized to a fault Boer commandos. Interesting factoid. That's where your military term commando comes from. Commandos were what the Boer units were called, but not a
Yeah.
unit as in singular. A group or a unit of multiple Boers were called a commando. And then the British, after the Anglo-Boer War, incorporated that word into their military vocabulary, and so it spread to America. So it's a fascinating thing to see where all these terminologies that you use today come from. I mean, another word like that is trek. So the Great Trek that happens in 1838, mass migration of Boers into the interior due to being treated as second-class citizens in the Cape. They trek into the interior, and that a great trek or that moment animates the or imagination of the British observers so much that it injects the word trek into the British language. So if the great trek of the Boers didn't happen, you wouldn't have Star Trek
Okay. Yeah.
today.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
what was the vision of life there? I mean, before South Africa becomes a country, like
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
just a settlement, but people
Mm.
keep on, it keeps on growing and stuff. So, is there like an
Right.
identity that forms?
Mm.
And is it? It sounds like a melting pot, but
Mm.
specifically at this point in this early part of the history, it's
Mm.
a European melting pot.
Mm. Right. So I'll go. It's a fascinating history. I just finished a book called The Afrikaners, a biography of a people by Herman Gilumia, a fascinating 700-page tome that pretty much just documents the entire biography of a people, as the title suggests, of the Afrikaners. So I've got some little, still some cliff notes at
Yeah.
the back of my mind. But I mean, it starts off in 1658 with the Dutch East India Company, with landing at the Cape of Good Hope, not to establish a colony, just to establish a rudimentary
Yeah.
refreshment station on the way to India. And the initial landing party is 82 men, 8 women, and they arrive on 3 ships. And then we fast forward a little bit. So 1754, a census of the Cape settlement about 100 years after the first arrival reveals that its settler population only stands at about
Oh,
510. That's 100 years later. So you get the picture. It's not a bustling colony. It's just this little tiny refreshment station at the southern tip of Africa. One of my friends has made the joke in saying the Afrikaners are probably one of the few peoples in the world that were seeded by a corporate venture. And
yeah.
that's what happened here. So it firstly, why this is important is it blows out of the water completely this narrative of the moment that these people landed at the Cape, the moment their boots hit the white sand, it was just like total oppression of the entire region, like colonial style. That's just not the case. For the first 100 years, it's just like between 50 and 500 people growing little refreshments for the ships coming past. And so let's fast forward a little bit more because this is another very important detail. So in about 1770, that's just over 100 years after they landed, the first contact is made between these European settlers and the Xhosa people, who are Black Africans or the Bantu people. So the settlers had encountered other Africans when they had arrived, but they had encountered the Khoi and the San, who are nomadic peoples. They're not related in any way to the Bantu-speaking peoples of Southern Africa. And that's an important detail because black South Africans are the descendants of the Bantu peoples, while colored South Africans, a genuine term, not a slur or anything, are the descendants of the Khoi and the San. So these are two different ethnic groups entirely. But today, radical politicians in South Africa claim that the descendants, for example, of the Bantus, the Bantu ancestors, have claim to the entirety of South Africa, which is simply not true. Demonstrated by the fact that the settlers that arrived here only encountered the first black Africans, the first Bantu-speaking peoples, 100 years or 1,000 kilometers from where they landed. Now, I'll leave that. I can't do the sum in my head now about how many miles 1,000 kilometers is, but
Yeah.
it's a long way. So that's the initial seed. And then the next important chapter, if you're watching, if the Afrikaners was a series, the next important episode in the series is British, well, the end of the Dutch East India Company in 1799, which is then swiftly followed by the British occupation and annexation of the Cape in about, I think, 1806. So now this plants the seeds of the Great Trek, because what's happening here is now these proto-Afrikaners, they're not completely formed yet culturally or ethnically, but the foundations are being laid of a people. They are being now treated as second-class citizens. Firstly, all their schools are now being anglicized. The language being spoken in public or from the ruling authorities is now exclusively being turned into English. The entire legal system that they had been using for decades is now just replaced with the British system. They are ethnically treated as inferior. They are treated as barbaric. They are treated as not civilized to the level of their British counterparts. And all of this just accumulates stress on this group to the point where by 1838, they've just had enough and they embark on the Great Trek. Pretty much trekking into the unknown to get away from living under this thumb or imperial thumb of the British Empire. And just to give you some context, these are not people with nothing to lose and now they're just moving. They are leaving. A lot of them are quite wealthy. A lot of them are leaving their farms, all their possessions behind, only taking with them what they can fit on a single ox wagon. You can think of the trek, your own American trek west. You've got that little ox wagon and whatever you can fit in there, those are your worldly possessions now. So it's not a economic decision that they're making. They're not trekking for greater security. They're not trekking for greater wealth. They're trekking to escape an existential threat
Yeah.
to their community because they are being anglicized and they're losing their very identity is being threatened, and they would rather they collectively make this choice. We would rather trek into the great unknown. We have no idea what we're going to encounter. I mean, take into account this is still during a time where people genuinely believe Africa is the dark continent in regard to there are monsters and dragons and dinosaurs out there.
So
Dinosaur-like
that
monsters.
trek then wasn't like a what Manifest Destiny that inhabits the American push west. You guys aren't going to conquer the continent. It's so the sense of frontier is different.
We're not trekking out of a
So
position
it's not
of
we're going to
strength.
conquer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not, yeah, yeah. It's not an expansion.
Okay.
It's a move. It is a
Okay.
changing of scenery. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of aesthetic and uh, cultural similarities, but the driving forces
And
are completely
also the
different.
backing, like when we travel west, we have the back of the east. We have backing of the east. Power radiates out. You guys are escaping power, so you have nothing to fall back on. So
Yeah. So
yeah.
you're
So
leaving most
what are
behind.
they?
Yeah.
They're just seeking peace. They're taking the tools of organization, of agriculture, and advanced economics with them. But what do they expect to find, and what do they find, and how do they have to then
Yeah.
establish diplomacy with the people that they find when they trek north?
Right. So these people that are trekking, I think another important detail is as they're trekking, they're not taking a huge database of knowledge with them. The only book that they carry with them is literally the Bible. They don't take anything else with them, and they trek into the interior with their Bibles and their guns. And I'm not saying that in any disparaging way. That's the what's happening. And what do they encounter? Well, now they're trekking into the interior. They're trekking in the direction of where the Bantu migration from the north, which is also happening over a vast amount of distance, is also happening. So what you'll find is on the one side, you'll see just a very densely populated part of the country. And then on the other side, you'll just see this demographic black hole. There's nothing there. Well, you can almost draw the separation with a ruler. Why is that? Because up until that a certain point in the geography of South Africa, you cannot sustain a settlement of people without borehole technology. So at some point, the Bantu migration stops because they are cattle herding and raising peoples, and there's just a part of South Africa where that you can't establish settlements anymore based on how dry and arid it is. And if you look at that map, it tells the whole story. And where did the Europeans land? Well, they landed at the southern tip. So if you look at that map, you'll see all the way down at the southern tip of that map, there's like this tiny little tail that sticks out, or just this little protrusion. That's where they landed. That's the Cape of Good Hope, the Bay of Good Hope. So now the Boers are trekking into where they are inevitably now going to collide with the Bantu migration from the north. So what happens? Well, three things happen which shape the future of South Africa forever. Land is acquired by three means: by conquest, by deals, and by unclaimed empty land. Now people will say, well, how's there all this unclaimed empty land? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, South Africa is a massive place. There's a reason why South Africa, the name South Africa, matches the name of a region rather than a country. It fits in with Southeast Asia, North Africa, Western Europe. South Africa fits into that category because it is the size of a region and it has the complexity of a region as well. So on the one side, people aren't trekking into a densely populated area. They are trekking into a vast open subcontinent almost, or just a massive open piece of land. And there's another reason why there's a lot of empty land, because this trek coincides with the Mfecane, which means the crushing, which is the Zulu Empire forming, and they are destroying everything in their wake as they start forming one of the first mega empires of Southern Africa. So a lot of people are fleeing from this. A lot of people are being destroyed, being crushed, as the name implies, by the growing and the rise of the Zulu Empire. So the Boers are also trekking into this unknown, and they're just finding carnage, and they don't know. They have no idea what happened here. So that's the other reason. So those three things happen. There are deals being made between the Boers and the tribes that they encounter. There are also instances of conquest, and then there are instances of empty land being settled. But in the South African discourse, we only talk about the conquest part because that's relevant to politics. The other two are treated as if it didn't happen. It's too politically
conquest means
inconvenient.
military. So what was the military formation, and then how did that imprint itself on South African identity or Afrikaner identity?
Well, it's definitely not very centralized or sophisticated. It is small, well-organized units that pretty much are at that time already referred to as commandos. And it's pretty much guerrilla warfare, well, not guerrilla warfare, but very mobile, not very organized in the sense of having all these formations and all different types of artillery and everything. No, you're just guys on horseback with your rifles, but with very good knowledge of the terrain and of warfare in that part of the world. So the military scene, but it's not massive armies. It's not everyone wearing the same military uniform. It's not different types of technology. It's very much guns
So
and
how do
horses.
what do they find when they settle? when they get far enough away from their
Mm.
erstwhile oppressors and
Mm.
they start to settle, like what do they
Yeah.
settle
Well,
for?
they find more fertile land that they can settle on and farm on, and then a short while later they
Oh,
find diamonds and
okay.
gold after establishing two Boer republics. So the Boer republics that were established were the Transvaal, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the ZAR, and the Orange Free State. These were the two main republics because these Boers were philosophically
Hmm.
Republicans at the end of the day. So they wanted to create their own republics. They had many other smaller ones, but those are the two main ones. And then within the territory of the Transvaal Republic, they find
Hmm.
diamonds and gold, which these Boers are are fleeing the eye of Sauron, the imperial focus, and then they find something that glistens so brightly that the empire cannot help but recognize it and see it and
Yeah.
be tempted by it. And soon the Brits are on their doorstep once again, and that lays the foundation for the first Anglo-Boer War, which the Boers win, but it's not nearly on the same scale as the second one, which then leads up to the second one in. The first Anglo-Boer War starts in the early
Mm.
1880s. The Boers win, and then not a lot of battles constitute this war, but the Boers win, and then the second Anglo-Boer War starts in 1899. It lasts until 1902. It is the first, many argue, the first modern, full-scale modern war. It drags the British military kicking and screaming into the 20th century, forces them to overhaul the
Mm.
entire military because they were pretty much still just stuck in the 19th century in regards to the technology, the
Yeah.
tactics, the training. I mean, they were training, the only type of training they were doing were on non-moving still targets. They were standing still. And now they're fighting a force
Hmm.
that are highly mobile, that are shooting at you from all sides, very mobile on their horses, that know the terrain. And also, once again, sufferers of bureaucracy. The British military at that time was just completely just
Hmm.
suffocated with bureaucracy. So on the one side, the Boers are all digging trenches. Also, the Anglo-Boer War, the first mass use of trench warfare, which sets up nicely, sets the scene for the First World War,
Wow.
just over a decade later. And what you're seeing now on the two sides is the Boers are all digging trenches. So every man does every responsibility because they're a lot more
Yeah.
decentralized, a lot more individualistic. And then on the British side, there's like every battalion has like two combat engineers and it's their job to dig the trenches. All the other guys are sitting back and saying, it's not my job. So by the time the Boers are already done with all their preparations, the Brits are still lagging behind. So that all
Hmm.
has to change as well. Also, the whole tactics around shooting in volleys. You're shooting against an opponent that's not running at you with spears and or Stone Age tech. You're fighting against an opponent that have rifles that rival yours, and they are moving very fast and very swiftly. And they figure out, well, if our opponents are just shooting in volleys, we just wait for them all to stand up and then we shoot them. And the another innovation that happened was the changing of the Brits first arrived in their classic red coats. The red coats stand out like a sore thumb on the brown African savannah, or like the gray brown African savannah. So they had to change that into their khaki or
Yeah.
their light brown attire, which you see in the First and Second World War as well. I'm just touching on it roughly, but I mean, such a fascinating war in history. If your audience is very interested in exactly what I'm talking about here, the modernization of the British military during that time, they should watch the two episodes by Jocko Willink on his podcast. You can literally just search on YouTube Anglo-Boer War. Jocko Willing podcast, and he did two episodes just analyzing how the British Empire had to overhaul their
Well, who's
entire military
supporting the
during this
Boers in
conflict.
this war? Are they rich enough to? Yeah, so that
Nobody.
but they have to get the guns from somewhere. They don't have foundries, and they do
Yeah.
advanced.
Yeah. So they have a lot of their own guns already, but then they are getting some support from Germany, who is
Okay.
selling guns to them, and that's it. But not on a large scale. It's not like Germany is
Huh.
entering the conflict, but they are sending them
Okay.
some guns. But it's very much a force that is highly equipped going up against a force that is very ill-equipped in the Boers in regards to their technology or their weaponry, and they don't have a lot of cannons or anything that they can use. But what their advantage is, they know the terrain. They are using tactics that the British military are struggling to respond to. So what happens is within the first year, about the first year, the Brits already capture the two capitals of the two Boer republics of the Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State and Pretoria
Okay.
in the ZAR. And then they're like, all right, we're playing chess. We checkmate. Your king has been captured. This is the end. And the Boers are like, we're not playing chess. And they don't surrender even if their two capitals had been captured. And they just switch over to full-on guerrilla warfare mode, total insurgency mode, start blowing up bridges, railway networks, using ambushes, highly mobile fighting tactics. Now the British are fighting an enemy. They've not faced this type of enemy until that point. Again, if you look at the history of the 20th century, this conflict again just
Wow.
almost foreshadows the
Yeah.
century to come. So now they have to invent fighting against an insurgency force or
Wow.
against the guerrilla warfare force. But and this is the final chapter in the Anglo-Boer War story. How do you break insurgency force or a guerrilla warfare force that is not giving up even when you have captured their two capitals? Well, the British Empire institutes but they institute a total scorched earth policy. Now, you have to understand, they budgeted for this war that it's going to end within 3 months. It's now been dragging on for 3 years. They're being pushed to the edge of bankruptcy and they are becoming the laughing stock of the entire Europe. Europe is losing respect for the British Empire because they can't defeat this ragtag team of people they call barbarians up until this point.
Yeah. Well, but and again, they're doing this for
Mhm.
diamonds and gold. Basically, they're doing this for resources, or is there like a
They're
I
doing
don't know.
it for two reasons. For one, the diamonds and gold, and then secondly, the strategic position of
Yeah.
Southern Africa being in
Okay.
control of that beachhead.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I mean South Africa at that time now has the largest gold reserves in the world. So it doesn't take a creative imagination to understand what's going on here. So yeah, now the scorched earth policy is being full force enacted. What does this entail? Well, firstly, it entails burning down every single Boer farm and not just burning down every Boer farm, also killing all the livestock that they find, destroying all the crops that they find. And then the women and children on these farms are then loaded up and shipped to the world's first mass concentration camps
Well,
in the early 1900s. Again, another instance of the 20th century being foreshadowed in the Anglo-Boer War. And the tragic end is that, well, that's how they win. Because now, firstly, on the one side, you're cutting off the supply lines for the Boers. They can't get refreshments at the farms anymore. And you're destroying their will to fight because now their women and children are dying in concentration camps. And what do you then what do you have left to fight for?
yeah.
And in the end, the result is that more women and children die in those concentration camps than soldiers on both sides combined.
Whoa. Wow. Okay.
And that's the end of the war.
Yeah, but how does that color the national identity then? That sets up the stage for a massive ethnic resentment.
That sets up the stage for the for Afrikaner politics for the next at least 100 years, because
Really?
now
Okay.
now 1910, after Anglo-Boer War ends 1902, 1910 South Africa is born. The entity called South Africa is born in 1910. So before 1910, South Africa doesn't exist. South Africa is Southern Africa, which is a collection of the Boer republics, the Cape Colony, and different tribal lands. And
Mm-hmm.
that's all then consolidated and united under one banner, one country, one entity in 1910 called South Africa. The borders are pretty much the same still today. Now, What happens? First point of very strong friction, as you now have picked up on. Now the First World War breaks out. Now South Africa is under British. It's a British dominion, part of the British Empire. What does that mean? Well, that means South Africa is going to fight on Britain's side against the Germans who helped the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War, and the Boers are going to have to go fight on Britain's side, on the side of the empire that put their women and children in concentration camps just over less than 10 years, or just over 10 years ago,
Yeah.
which causes such major friction that you get in 1914, you get the Maritz Rebellion, or as we refer it among Afrikaners, almost unofficially, the Afrikaner Civil War, which is pretty much the two Afrikaner factions fighting it out against each other about whether to go fight on the side of Britain or not.
Hmm.
That pretty much is how the 20th century starts for the Afrikaners, and it sets the stage for all the way until the National Party takes power in 1948, because in the Second World War we go fight on the British side again, and by 1948 Afrikaners are just sick and tired of being a subject to the British Empire and not
Yeah.
having their destiny into their own hands, which then creates the fertile ground for the rise of the National Party and their win electorally in 1948, and then that since between 1948 and 1994, the National Party rules South Africa, and I mean, this is there's a reason why when you take a political science course, they always say South Africa is not for beginners. There's a lot of factors that are factoring into the rise of the National Party, the apartheid system being instituted, and one of these reasons is again this just existential struggle of the Afrikaners. As I said, why I need to put that little footnote there is it's so easy to then twist that and saying, oh, well, Adams just says the only reason for apartheid was just Afrikaners wanting to rule themselves. No, it's one of the major factors that are driving the rise of the National Party. Because as you've been able to deduce from this story for the past 300 years, Afrikaners only really had their own republics for a handful of decades until it was all smashed and destroyed again, and they were colonized once again. That always breaks the leftist brains. White
Yeah.
people colonizing other white people, putting
Yeah.
white people putting other white people in concentration camps.
Well, what's happening with the non-whites during all this conflict between the
Well,
whites?
they are pretty much the cheap labor force that is being utilized to drive the South African economy, especially in the mining sector. South Africa becomes a completely dominant. The South African economy becomes completely dominated by the mining sector. And at that time, we don't have all these sophisticated mining technologies. You need raw manpower for that. So the black population of South Africa, where they're being moved, how they're being seen politically, how they are being treated politically, is all down to them being used as cheap labor for this economic industrial system, for this industrial machine, all centered around mining. So before we continue, there's just another quote that I wanted to add, because if you understand this quote, then you understand the Afrikaners pretty well in regards to why we do what we do over many centuries. So this is a quote from Milan Kundera, a Czech writer, also a minority. So he's writing from a same position of existential threat. And his quote goes like this: small nations, the concept is not quantitative. It points to a condition, a fate. Small nations lack the felicitous sense of an eternal past and future, and at any given moment in their history, they all pass through the antechambers of death. In constant confrontation with the arrogant ignorance of the mighty, they see their existence as perpetually threatened, with a question mark hovering over it, for their very existence is the question. If you understand that quote, then you are well on your way to understanding the Afrikaners.
Yeah. Whoa. Okay. This is not for beginners. There's so many moving parts
Yeah.
and pieces to this. So there's
Yeah.
earlier on in our conversation, you spoke about there's a difference between the blacks and the coloreds as ethnic groups. Are they treated distinctly or differently politically, or when does the establishment of white and black become dominant? And is that from
Hmm.
the whites, or because the whites don't even have a singular identity either?
Hmm.
When does it get
Right.
parsed out into like two or three,
Hmm.
or simplified
Yeah.
politically? And then there's the
So
whole
black,
Indian
yeah.
question too.
Hmm. So black South Africans are a combination between various different cultures and languages. And South Africa culture and language are close.
Yeah. Yeah.
So black South Africans, there's no majority ethnic group in South Africa. The Zulus are the largest, but they're not a majority numerically. So you have Zulus, Vendas, Xhosas, Sotho's, Chongas. South Africa has 11 official languages, each one of those languages corresponding with a different culture. So I think
And
that
those cultures
that
are
gives you the
ancient.
idea.
They aren't just
Yeah,
they're not
they're very
newfangled by any
old.
means. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, some of them are older than others. I mean, the Zulu culture only really formed in 1812,
Okay.
but some of the other cultures are much older. And then you have the colored population of South Africa, who are the descendants of many different people. So they are firstly the descendants of the Khoi and the San, the nomadic cultures that the Europeans first encountered in the Western Cape, what we call the Western Cape today,
Hmm.
where they landed. They have no relation to the Bantu speaking tribes, the ancestors of the black South Africans. They are a completely different ethnic group on their own. That's the one branch of the tree. The other influence on the colored culture are the slaves that were imported by the British Empire and by the Dutch East India Company from from Eastern from Asian countries, especially Malay slaves. And then thirdly, they are also many of them are the descendants of mixed race families, where
Hmm.
white and black, or white and Khoisan, or white and Malay. Um, that's where they ethnically then fit in. So that, and they are today, the colored population is still an ethnic group that is distinct. They see themselves as distinct. They have a unique culture. They have a unique place in South Africa. They don't see themselves as black. They don't. There was this controversy recently of a colored artist from South Africa going to the United States, and she referred to herself as colored and not black. And then she was attacked by black Americans as, why would you call yourself that? And then she had to explain to them, like, no, it's not the same thing.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, and then the white population in South Africa is also incredibly complex. It's not just Afrikaners or not just white. It's firstly, the Afrikaners are the largest grouping. So at the moment, unfortunately, the South African government is not very good at many things, and one of those things, it can't keep the lights on, which means it also can't do a proper census, which means that when it comes to particularly census data, the last proper census that's in any way trustworthy would be the 2011 census, which is long ago. But I mean, the latest one, the 2022 one, is inusable. It's like the data is in such a bad state, and the methodology so flawed, you can't use it, not even in passing. So based on the 2011 data and a little bit of an educated guess, I would say the white population of South Africa currently stands at about between 4.5 million and 5 million. And out of that 5 million, about 2.7 million are Afrikaners, and the rest are Anglo descent, Greeks, Portuguese, very large Portuguese population in South Africa. Many of them, the descendants, their ancestors came from either landed in Southern Africa or come from Angola and Mozambique. So you've got that complexity as well, and these different cultural groups in South Africa also don't all vote the same. They don't. Their communities aren't organized in the same way. For example, among Afrikaners, collectively organizing around your cultural identity is not a taboo. It's not
Yeah.
strange at all. But among Anglo South Africans, it is one of the worst taboos that you could ever do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Anglo South Africans are almost extremely individualistic. Don't refer to your group. Don't organize around your identity. You are an individual. You only represent yourself. While Afrikaners are much more community orientated in that regard of organizing around your cultural identity, and there's no problem with we see no problem with it. That's why the joke goes. So in South Africa, there are many Afrikaner organizations that are pioneering community-based solutions. We can get into that if you want. But with hundreds of thousands of members and that are donating to these organizations, I work for one of them called AfriForum. That's part of the Solidarity movement. But it's organizations and institutions with a particular strong Afrikaner and Afrikaans identity and a Christian identity, unashamedly. And while this is happening on the one side, what are the Anglo-South Africans are organizing in a different way? They have think tanks. They have research institutions, but they don't have an AfriForum or a solidarity movement or cultural institutions in that
Yeah,
way.
it's the
So
gun
yeah,
and the Bible crew against the
yeah.
Anglo system bureaucratic liberals, I guess.
Yeah, they're ideologically also a very strong. There's also been a very strong difference. Afrikaners are very predominant, are predominantly conservative and much more conservative and less individualistic in the liberal sense than the Anglo-South Africans, who are predominantly liberal and individualistic. But at the same time, there's also a lot of overlap. I mean, if you were to
Yeah.
compare a lot of English white South Africans to British or you people from the UK, they would look like right wingers. But at the same time, in the South African context, there is a strong ideological difference as well, particularly around identity and how you should organize, in what forms you should organize, and in what forms are taboo to organize.
Could we get into apartheid?
Sure.
From my point of view, growing up in United States progressive education, it was just pure racism. It was just pure whites are good, blacks are bad, or something like that. Why was it established? And under what conditions was it established? And to what degree was it the dominant political formation for a period of time in South Africa?
So the apartheid system was established after the rise of the National Party win in 1948. Apartheid, I can't exactly remember when. It wasn't on the dot 1948 when the system was established. It was a few years later, but it lasted from then until probably the 1980s, when it started being reformed and deconstructed. The narrative goes that it just lasted all the way to 1994 and then it was cut off. That's not the case. It had already been in a strong direction of reform and a deconstruction for a long time. So as I say, there's many factors at play here, but the two main factors, and again, have to preface this with, this is a reduction of many complex forces and things working in the background, but there are two main influences on why the system is being established. On the one side, it is Afrikaners seeking to re-establish their republic. I mean, in 1961, South Africa is declared a republic, and it exits from the Commonwealth, and the Afrikaners believe that through the power of the state, they got their republic back. So it fits into that longer narrative, that longer story of the Afrikaners constantly wanting their republic. They want their Afrikaner republic, their own place, where they have their destiny in their own hands, not under the thumb of any imperial force. And that's the cultural drive, the existential drive behind it. Also, there's a major economic difference at the moment between Afrikaners and Anglo-South Africans as well. Anglo-South Africans completely dominating industry. In the 1940s, Afrikaners only had control over 1% of industry in South Africa. So that's the context that this is also happening. But at the same time, what is also driving this, and this is not just the Afrikaners that are being driven by this, the entire system is being driven by this, and I alluded to this earlier, is the exploitation of cheap black labor, because this massive economic machine that you've created needs manpower. And apartheid, on the one side, is this attempted answer to the existential threat that the Afrikaners have been feeling ever since almost they had been a people. And on the other side, there's the more cynical economic side of, we want to create an industrial economy, and this industrial economy centered around mining and agriculture, but predominantly mining, needs a lot of manpower and cheap manpower. And we have a lot of cheap manpower. So apartheid becomes, on the one side, a preservation, existential on existential preservation effort, but on the other side, it just becomes a massive logistical project to be able to figure out the logistics of applying cheap black labor
Yeah.
to building this massive industrial machine.
Well, without a strong economic engine, you will never have sovereignty. So you have to figure out how to stand on your
Mm,
own feet and get a seat at the table, like in a
mm.
world that is now based on trade, post World War II.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, those are the two main factors. On the one side, there's the cultural one, and on the other side, there's the very much the existing or the cynical economic one. And I think there's another thing that needs to be taken into account, and that is where are where are the Anglo-South Africans in all of this? So they are part of the story, they are part of the picture, but there's something interesting happening here. They're retreating from politics because politics is becoming the domain of the Afrikaners because the Afrikaners are in the ascendancy politically. The British Empire is disintegrating, and that's having an effect on the confidence of the British English speaking South Africans as well. And they retreat into the private sector. So they become entrepreneurs, just want to make as much money as possible. Also exploiting making full exploitation of the cheap labor dynamic that I'm explained
Mm-hmm.
earlier, but they're not as much into politics. And there's a great quote from Herman Gilumir from that book that I referenced, The Afrikaners, that I just quickly want to read it. It sums up where they find themselves at the moment. So I quote, the per capita income of English speakers in South Africa by 1948 was more than double that of the Afrikaners. Their level of education was much higher, and they identified with a British culture that was vastly richer and more diverse than the Afrikaner culture. They tended to find little that was attractive in the Afrikaners' culture, and very few read Afrikaans books or newspapers. Yet the English community in South Africa found itself in the political wilderness, one of the largest English-speaking communities in the world without any political power. And that sums
Mm.
up what's going on in that part of the white population.
Mm-hmm. And so how does apartheid take place? Like what's the
Mm.
initial organization of it?
Mm. So again, complex reality being simplified, but what's basically happening is on the one side, you have the very strict how would you say this? I'm trying to translate in my head these policies. You have the designation of areas for different population groups based
Okay.
on the Population Registration Act. So the Tswanas live here, the Zulus live here, the Sutus live here, and everyone is designated to their own area. They're Bantustan. That's what they were called. They're these the you know you can say you can debate about how sincere this was, but I mean that on the one side the idea with the Bantustans was to create independent republics of their own or independent nations of their own to transition them towards that. It was a total failure, but on the one side that was how it was designed. But again, as Professor Dani Goosen says, apartheid, the best description of apartheid would be one of the most clear-cut examples of a modernist project of modernity, the age of projects, the great projects of
Yeah.
here. The project is to sort every people into their place and to then
Yeah.
give them the freedom that they give them freedom
Yeah.
and sovereignty in their own place in this time.
Well, I can't imagine
But at the
trying to
same
rule
time,
such
yeah,
a diverse communities
yeah.
overlapping.
But at
So
the
if
same
you
time,
separate
there's
them, that
this,
would be a lot easier,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So, but at the same time, there's a contradiction and a paradox going on. Within the National Party, there's also a division. On the one side, you have the idealists that are genuinely trying to, as I said, create these independent black nations where they summed it up as we want to give them what we have always wanted for ourselves. So the Afrikaners have always strived for their own place in the sun, their own republic, and they want to give this to the other peoples of South Africa as well. That's the idealists on the one side. But on the other side, you have the cynical economic side of, but we also don't want to give up all the economic benefits of all this cheap labor that is there to be utilized. So it becomes this monstrosity of trying to balance, on the one side, the cultural idealism, but also on the other side, we can't be too separate because we want to use this black labor to power the economy and the industrial machine. So as I said, it becomes this absurd and very, very typical of the 20th century logistical project of moving cheap labor around, but not having it settled too close or too permanently, because that then threatens the cultural project that apartheid, or the existential and cultural project that apartheid is at the same time. So
Yeah.
it's within the National Party, there's this constant battle between the two sides. On the one side is the cynical exploitation of cheap labor. On the other side, we want to give to everyone what we want for ourselves. And in the end, it just doesn't work. It's like someone trying to stand in two rowboats at the same time and falling in the water in the middle. So that project fails, that great modernist project, as Professor Dani Goosen says.
Hmm.
And that's the story of the second half of the 20th century in South Africa, is that system that for all it has a lot of similarities to an empire, as you said there. It has all this diversity. It's a massive landmass. I mean, South Africa is almost the size of the entire European continent.
Hmm.
If you want some perspective, just Google South African map overlay Europe, and you'll see
Yeah.
it's the size of Europe minus like two countries. So it's this massive landmass, dozens of different cultures, dozens of different languages, all being administered from one
Yeah.
central point. It is a, it might not look like it because it's very chaotic, but it is an empire to some extent. It's operating like an empire to some extent.
Can we do a footnote
And
real quick? I'm looking at the
sure,
map while you're talking. There's a country, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Lesotho. It's just right landlocked.
Lesotho.
Lesotho.
Yes,
Are
exactly.
that's just a carve out or a reservation or what
That's
is
that's
this?
just a little ethno state.
Okay. So in
It's
the
the Sotho
divvying
ethno
up of all
state.
these ethno states, this one actually congeals.
It also has a fascinating history, but I'll have to go brush up on it. But I mean, what's happening
Okay.
there is the Sotho people, have a protectorate called Lesotho, which is almost like, it's like 95%. That's why it's not an exaggeration to call it an ethno state. It's a Sotho country in the middle of South Africa, but because it was a British protectorate, it couldn't be incorporated into South Africa. It's always had its independence, so it was just always independent. But yeah,
Okay.
it's a country on its own. It's
Yeah.
where the Sothos live.
Yeah, you guys get along with them? I mean, they don't try to the
South
territory is pretty stable, let's put it that way.
Post 1994, South Africa fought a war against them and lost. But I mean, that's a
Oh,
that's a
really lost.
fascinating story on
Okay.
its own. Yeah.
Interesting.
In the
Okay.
90s, with what was it called? Operation Bolias. We invaded Lesotho because there was political instability there, and we went in as a quote unquote peacekeeping force, but
Liberation,
with a lot
yeah.
of other cynical political agendas in the background, and we were beaten back. So the South
Okay.
African government, the South African military did not succeed. But
Okay.
that's post 1994. That's under Nelson Mandela.
Okay. So when apartheid finally just dissolves, what happens to the country? Free fall? Like how much chaos is introduced into the shaking up of this system?
So this is my favorite question because this has been my life. I mean, that's where I grew up in. I was
This
born
is
just
your
after the end of apartheid. I
moment.
was born in 1996. So that means my entire life has been witnessing post 1994 South Africa. So I still remember very vividly late 90s, early 2000s is peak South Africa. Like nothing can go wrong. Red carpet is rolled out for us. South Africa is the great miracle. Economic growth is fantastic. Everything is just amazing.
Okay.
And because now the world's opened up to us again, all the sanctions are lifted. We get all
Yeah.
these the special treatments and favors because we are the future of the
Progressive.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lapel pin.
we are like
Yeah.
the progressive paragon of the world. Everyone should be like South Africa. That's what you hear.
Yeah.
And then a nexus of a lot of different factors
Interests.
collide in the early 2000s. So what happens here is, so I'm trying to see how I can sum it up because again it's such a, I mean, we can do an episode on every one of these little
Yeah,
chapters
I
in
bet.
in in the history, but yeah. So what basically happens is this post 1994 momentum also coincides with one of the largest commodity super cycles in history, and South Africa is an incredibly commodities-rich country. Another very important factor here. So economic growth is great, unemployment's going down, state debt is going down, and then in 2008, the global financial crisis hits. And it coincides with the end of that commodity super cycle. And it coincides with the ANC, the ruling party, initiating phase two of the National Democratic Revolution. So what is
Oh,
the,
cool.
let's rewind
I
a
was
little bit.
waiting for the Marxists to show up.
So South Africa is ruled by was ruled until 20, no, well, de facto it's still ruled by this. Anyway, let's keep it as simple as possible. It gets very complicated. South Africa has been was ruled solely by the ANC since 1994 till 2004, 2024, 30 years. The ANC was the sole ruling party, but it was part of an alliance. The alliance was called the Tripartite Alliance. So the Tripartite Alliance is the ANC, COSATU, who represents the labor unions, and the third part of the puzzle, the SACP, the South African Communist Party, which has been, they don't contest in elections because they're already in power. They're part of this alliance.
Okay.
So that has the result that many ministers over the past 30 years have been South African Communist Party members, including one of our former ministers of finance. South African Communist Party, still part of this tripartite alliance still today. So what is the National Democratic Revolution? Well, on the one side, the ANC does not view itself as a liberal party. It is a leftist party. It is a revolutionary party, but also a very certain type of revolutionary party, one rooted in the Cold War. They still, in 2025, they still refer to each other as comrade, like unironically. They do speeches, top brass of the ANC, and refer to their fellow ANC members as comrades. And they adopt as their like guiding philosophy the theory called the National Democratic Revolution, which is a Soviet theory that pretty much states that you transition once you gain power, you transition through three stages. The Soviets gave up this theory. The ANC still hold on to it like a relic of the Cold War.
Wow.
Stage one is you pretend or you make yourself out to be a liberal force. So you gain power through under the banner of being for individual rights, constitutionalism, non-racialism, checks and balances, protecting private property rights. And all of this happens in the 90s. The ANC very effectively paints itself as this incredibly liberal force. Nobody wants to call them the leftists that they are and revolutionaries that they are, because that would tarnish this miracle story. So
Yeah.
the world plays along as well. They don't believe their lying eyes, even though there's like pictures of the ANC just like doing like salutes in front of like hammers and sickles. But anyway, and they are like in alliance with the South African Communist Party, which is writing policy for the ANC. And so that's the first phase of the National Democratic Revolution. You gain power through liberal means. The second phase, and they plan this out, so they have certain dates where they say, well, now at this stage we transition to the next stage. They had identified around 2008, around there, as the transition period. About 15 years after gaining power in 1994 is when we transition to the second phase. What is the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution? Just before I continue, everything that I'm saying here, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but like you can find this on their website. It's like
Yeah.
you don't have to go dig through the archives, go down a rabbit hole. It's like an anti-rabbit hole. You just visit the ANC like websites and all their history that's documented there. It's all there. They still
Yeah.
reference all of this today. So anyway, because I know a lot of international people will listen to this and they're like, where do I start with this rabbit hole? I'm like, no, well, you just go to their website, like you visit like a McDonald's website. So when it comes to the second phase that is initiated around 2008 under Jacob Zuma, the ANC president that comes after Thabo Mbeki. So their first president is Nelson Mandela, then Thabo Mbeki, and then Jacob Zuma in 2009. The ANC officially announces to the country the first phase of the National Democratic Revolution has now concluded. We are now transitioning into the second phase. The second phase is the transition to socialism. So then you use the power that you've gained through the liberal means and liberal approach. You use that then to transition to socialism. How does that work? Well, they've achieved this through what they call the process of cadre deployment. Cadre deployment means you use the mechanisms of the state to deploy party loyalists to every single tentacle and branch imaginable of the state. No matter how small, you need a party loyalist in there. That's what they call a cadre. A cadre is a party loyalist, the old Marxist or revolutionary term. They do this since gaining power in 1994. They announced, that's their official strategy. It's not a conspiracy theory. They refer to it as cadre deployment. It's the official strategy. So they do this for the entire reign as as the ruling party. And this enables them to then transition into phase two, which you can literally see on a graph kicking in. If you look at the graph of state debt or state loaning of money by the South African government, as soon as they announce stage two of the National Democratic Revolution, that graph just shoots up in the air. Because now they start loaning a hell of a lot of money to start funding all of these supercharge these social programs, become more centralize more things in the hands of the state. And that all leads up until today, 2025, where more than 50% of the South African population is dependent on some form of government grant. Mm-hmm. And this is not a fact that the ANC laments, it is a fact that they celebrate. They celebrate the fact. In the State of the Nation at the beginning of every year, the president says, this year, in the past year, we added so many more people to social grants, and he says this to applause. He doesn't say this as something concerning. So that's where we still pretty much find ourselves in phase two of the National Democratic Revolution. Phase three has not been announced yet. But yeah, there's just one more detail that's important here. I'll make it quick. What also happens in 2008 is the start of rolling blackouts, which we refer to as load shedding in South Africa. I still remember it as a kid driving to school and it being announced over the radio that rolling blackouts will start tonight. And that crisis has not been solved. What's it now? I have to do my math. 2008, 2005, 2025, 17 years later.
Okay.
That we still have rolling blackouts. A week ago, we had rolling blackouts due to the same problem, the government just not being able to provide the country with adequate electricity. So,
well, that's
just
my
a
question then,
that I wanted to add.
If the state is supporting 50% of the population, where's the money coming from? Is it magical thinking, or is there like this reservoir of just magic money
through taxing the population into oblivion?
So half the population is supporting the other half of the population, and the part that's supporting them is the most economically viable half.
So I'll give you a stat to paint you the picture there. Just make sure I have the right one here, because it's constant. Here we go. So this paints the picture for you. Just 1 million South Africans, or 1.5% of the population, pay 61% of all personal income tax. That was the latest stat that was published February 2025.
Well, okay, so where do the Afrikaners fit into this?
Well, the Afrikaners are a very successful minority. So at the same, despite
they are now
the discrimination.
So there's this kind of inversion of the cheap labor force is now being offloaded to this really expensive.
I think it's very accurate to say that Afrikaners and the white minority in general is definitely one of the main driving forces behind this taxation. We're pretty much being farmed to fund this massive welfare industrial complex, and just that I think it breaks people's brains to imagine. But I mean, that's the thing: 1.5% of the population is paying 60% of the taxes, and they're
not being taxed 60% of their income; they're paying 60% of the government.
Yeah. So the tax rate is progressive in the sense that you are taxed based on your income bracket. So, but on average, I think a safe bracket to say that most people that are middle class would pay between 30 and 40% tax.
Okay. So how are the Afrikaners treated then? How is your
Mm,
safety? How is I guess you
mm,
guys are taxed a lot, but are you at least
mm,
provided safety? If not I guess not electricity to live your
mm.
lives, but are you protected at all, or is this still are you still in commando mode, guns and Bibles?
Well, we have to pay all those taxes, and then get blamed for every single problem or every single failure of the government.
Hmm.
That's the problem of being a successful, highly visible minority. And
Yeah.
this is always, it's the most dishonest argument ever, but there are genuinely malicious people out there that say, well, a lot of Afrikaners are not destitute. That means that you can't be treated that badly. You're like, no, it's a compliment. The fact that we are still successful despite,
Yeah.
firstly, being blamed for everything. Secondly, having our private property rights threatened on a constant basis. Thirdly, having legislation on the books that actively discriminates against us. This is all real. This is what all this big storm around South Africa is revolving around to a large extent in 2025. Because what happened is, up until this point, the South African government has just been getting away with treating minorities this badly. And
Yeah.
the blessing of Donald Trump's shining a light like into a dark room, and now everything is being revealed. The fact that South Africa has 142 race laws still on the books. The fact that the South African government just signed into law an act which enables expropriation of property without compensation by a ruling party that still hails Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe as a hero.
Hmm.
That doesn't give you a lot of reassurances when they say we would never touch private property rights. But also, Robert Mugabe is like a hero of the revolution, a
Hmm.
fantastic guy.
What is the accuracy of the social media viral phenomena of like kill the Boers? Like, is there like a true sentiment that it is deadly to be white? If you were to put it distill it down into a meme.
I think the best case study for the threats that Afrikaners, but also the minorities face in South Africa, would be the scourge of farm murders. I mean, this is also one of the topics that a lot of people, especially Elon Musk, is talking about. But I
Hmm.
mean, farm murders are a serious issue in South Africa. It's not a genocide. I mean, the numbers are unacceptable. It is a crime that is incredibly vicious. There are many aspects of this crime that are not normal. The critics of people that try to shine a light and bring awareness about this issue say, "Oh, it's just normal crime. South Africa is just a very violent country, you know." Well, here's some facts about that.
Hmm.
On the one side, the year on year, some years are worse than others, but on average, about 50 farmers are murdered in South Africa every year.
50
Swap
farmers.
out that profession with any other profession. What if it was 50 politicians? What if it was 50 podcast hosts? What if it was 50 doctors? What if it was 50 accountants? That's the one aspect that needs to be understood. On
Hmm.
the other side, there's the political environment. Farm murders are the only violent crime phenomenon in South Africa that is firstly denied by the president in totality, not even like it's not as serious as in it is not happening. The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, in 2028 went to New York to a conference there, and when asked by a Bloomberg journalist about farm murders, he said, and I quote, "There are no murdering of white farmers in South Africa," end quote.
Hmm.
What did the South African media do when he said that? Did they fact check him? No, they wrote breathless pieces literally titled "What the President Meant to Say" when he said there are no murdering of farmers in South Africa. So it's not even a nuanced argument. It's not even the president saying, well, it's not as bad. It is a serious issue, but not as bad. No, he's just outright saying no farmers are being murdered in my country. And he's
Yeah.
never retracted that claim. He's never apologized for that claim. That's the other thing. And then secondly, farm murders are the only violent crime phenomenon in South Africa actively encouraged by high profile politicians. Politicians like Julius Malema, you've seen the clip, chanting, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," Boer in Afrikaans means farmer, but just so he ensures everyone is crystal clear on what he means, he also says kill the farmer at the end, just so everyone knows exactly what he means,
Hmm.
and just so there's no misunderstanding. And he chants this to the most egregious example would be he's chanting this to a stadium of 100,000 people chanting with him,
Yeah.
kill the Boer, kill the farmer.
Yeah.
The other egregious example would be in 2020, where there was a horrific farm murder of Brendan Horner, a 21-year-old farm manager who was brutally murdered and hung on a pole, his body. And then in the court case happened in that town. There was a protest against farm murders where the farming community came together to protest against it. And then the EFF, the third largest party in the country, showed up as a counter protest to an anti-farm murders protest. And then they chanted, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, outside of the courthouse where the grieving parents of this young farmer are sitting inside within earshot.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that's just political, just some metaphors being thrown around. That's just some spicy language. No, that's genuine evil.
Yeah.
So that's the
Why?
other thing.
What did you farmers do? Like, was there a massive case of food poisoning at some point? Put a little too much Roundup in the grain or something? Like, why the
Well,
farmer of all? Like, why not kill the tech
because
support guy?
that's the political environment. Because the political environment is one of the ruling party blaming minorities, in particular Afrikaners, for
Okay.
every single failure that it has ever had. And a
Okay.
synonym for Afrikaners are Boers, which
Yeah.
translates to
To
farmer,
farmer. Okay.
because
Yeah.
Afrikaner culture is intimately intertwined with the career of farming, with the farming sector. My
Yeah.
colleague Dirk Herman sums it up very well, where he says, Afrikaners and farming are so close together as a culture and a profession that if you yourself, as an Afrikaner, are not a farmer, you have a family member that farms. If you don't have
Yeah.
a family member that farms, you have a friend that farms. You know someone that farms.
Yeah.
I grew up in a farming community. I have family members that farm. I have friends that farm. My uh, my family on both my mother and my father's side come from farming families. That's the Afrikaner story. That's why Afrikaners feel are particularly affected when it comes to farm murders as well. There are farmers of all ethnicities and cultures that are murdered. But when farmers are murdered, a disproportionate amount of them are going to be Afrikaners because Afrikaners are disproportionately involved in farming because we are
Yeah.
literally called as a culture collectively the farmers, the Boers. So that's on the one side. And then you have the villainization, where farmers in particular are framed by high profile politicians in the ruling party and others as land thieves, rapists, criminals, the descendants of people that genocided other peoples, stole land. That's and then if you send that message out to a population of 60 million people, is it
Mm.
any surprise that you then have
Yeah.
the high occurrence of farm murders where it's not just the murder, it is people going in to actively torture those people before they die in the worst imaginable ways. 80-year-old women having holes drilled in their feet with a power drill, 10-year-old children being drowned in a bathtub filled with boiling water, people's tongues being ripped out, people's eyes being stabbed out, people being tied up to watch as their wife is being raped by the perpetrators. And then these perpetrators leave without stealing anything in many cases, only sometimes taking the family car as a getaway vehicle and dumping it next to the road. This is not normal crime. Normal crime does not involve this high level of torture. Normal crime does not involve this level of just evil in regards to there's not even a profit motive. There's not even something being taken. So I apologize if I just demonetized your video. You're welcome to take out that part if you want, but I mean that's the
We'll risk it.
reality when it comes to the brutality of
That
these
doesn't
killings
seem
and
like
these
a
farm murders.
sustainable state of existence.
Well, that's why there's a unique counter strategy that's taking roots in regards to that's where the silver lining comes out. And I mean, that's how Afrikaners have reacted in the 20th century or post 1994 to losing state power. I mean,
Yeah.
that's my favorite part of the story because on the one side, in the 20th century, Afrikaners become statists for the first time. We dedicate all our resources and collective thinking into building a powerful industrialized state. And what happens then? You build this massive state around preserving your culture, defending your culture, creating a place for yourself, and then you lose control over that massive state in the 90s, and then that incredible
State goes
state
after you.
machine that you built started being used actively against you. I
Yeah.
mean, the we developed our own nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the level where we were at.
Yeah.
So what do you do then? You lose complete control. You've put all your eggs into that state basket. All the institutions that you built, educational institutions, community institutions that had no state influence, they were built up through donations and community organization. You can do your research yourself if you want. The Help Mekaar movement, which I wrote a piece for the European Conservative on, and what do the Afrikaners do when they gain control over the state? They plug in all of these community institutions that they've built into this massive new machine
Mm-hmm.
that they are building, which is a classic temptation. It's this
One ring.
almost like a devil's bargain. But
Yeah.
then the state gains control over all of these
Yeah.
community institutions. And then when you lose power over the state in 1994, all of these institutions go with it, including your universities, your schools, everything that you've had. Now you have to start over. And I mean, luckily, there was, as part of the 1994 agreement, there was provisions made for the protection of Afrikaans schools, but as is classic to the ANC, they broke that agreement by starting to target Afrikaans education very explicitly and viciously, especially now in 2025 through acts like the Bella Act, which actively looks to marginalize Afrikaans education. So what happens now? Do you just sit back and vote harder, or you're a 5% minority? Not even. You're a 5% white minority, a 2.5 or 2.7% Afrikaner minority. You can't vote yourself out of this. You can't vote harder. You can't just campaign harder. What do? Well, you start what we call the solidarity movement. That's one of the main strategies. So the solidarity movement is a network of 50 plus institutions, Afrikaner institutions, that all specialize in a particular thing. It starts off as Solidariteit, which is a Afrikaans labor union in 1997, which and when you think labor union, everyone always thinks left wing, but there's a Christian tradition to labor unions as well that I think needs to be rediscovered, especially in America and Europe. And it's from this tradition that the solidarity movement or Solidariteit is formed, and it has an explicit. It's a labor union with an explicit Christian identity and an explicit Afrikaner identity. And this labor union grows to the point where it starts branching out and creating other organizations in its orbit, one of these being AfriForum, being started in 2006. So before I get to AfriForum, because that's where I work, the other organizations in the solidarity movement, the other institutions, there are many, there's 50 plus, but some of the major ones are Marula Media, our own media publication, which gets now in 2025 over 2 million unique readers a month, Afrikaans publication. Then there's Solidariteit Helpende Hand, Solidariteit Helping Hand, which is our community-based welfare organization. There's the FAK, the Federation of Afrikaans Cultural Organizations, which focuses on heritage preservation, cultural preservation. Then there is Canton, our private construction company, and many others. Academia, our private university, Soltech, our private technical college. Fascinating story about Soltech. So Soltech, we built a campus for Soltech, or Afrikaans. So what do you do when the state is abolishing all Afrikaans education institutions? Well, then you build your own. So we crowdfunded Soltech, which is technical college where the Solidarity Movement has hundreds of thousands of members, about 200,000 members. And they asked them, are you willing to donate 10 Rand extra every month to go to a building fund? Now, 10 Rand is about 50 cents that you donate to a building fund, which the money we will be investing, and we will be growing that fund until we have enough to build a campus for Saltec. In 2020, we built that campus. We finished the campus. I just have to remember, I think it's 300 million Rand campus, and it serves 3,000 students now in 2025. So it's a world-class institution where the students that study there, they are 96% of them are absorbed into the labor force within 1 year after graduating. And it's all Afrikaans and Christian based. And it was built through crowdfunding. And we are currently funding, or crowdfunding again, the building of a new university campus for academia, a 3.2 billion Rand university campus, which we already bought the land where it will be built, and construction starts later this year. The last piece of the puzzle is AfriForum, where I work. So AfriForum is by this point, from what I can find, the largest community-based solutions and civil rights organization on the African continent, based on the amount of donating members that it has. So we have between 300 and 315,000 donating members, which give a donation of a minimum of 30 Rand, about $1 every month, to our organization. And we do a lot of things. So on the one side, we are predominantly a community-based solutions organization, an alternative to the party politics system, which has failed. But what's happened is as the South African government has receded, as its capacity has deteriorated, a massive void has opened up. A void in basic services that the government is supposed to be giving, supposed to be delivering, but is not delivering. Basic services like security. So what do? That void can only be filled by one of two factions, the good guys or the bad guys. The good guys are communities that organize, the bad guys are organized crime. Both of those are flourishing in South Africa currently. Yeah. So AfriForum falls under the good guys camp of we are organizing communities to fill that void where the state is failing. So we have over 170 branches all across the country, and these branches organize the AfriForum members in their community, and then they do everything from planting trees, filling thousands of potholes, maintaining infrastructure, painting street signs, cleaning rivers, and neighborhood watches. And this whole system is built around about 11,000 volunteers at any time, operating, doing it all for free, not being paid to do it. The security side of it is actually the most demonstrative of the case studies. So we have, and this is how we answer the question of, for example, farm murders as well. So we have over 175 neighborhood and farm watches all across the country. And this is not your grandma's neighborhood watch with like pepper spray. Like these are well-equipped, well-trained people that are operating within the bounds of the law. They're not cowboys. They're not vigilantes. So there's 175 plus of them all across the country, and they organize their community to keep it safe where the police are failing. But they're also not an anti-police organization, so we cooperate with the local police stations as well. And this is where the divide between the ruling party or the national government and the local level government comes in. So we have no frictions on local level. The local police stations are completely overwhelmed, understaffed, under-resourced. So when a neighborhood watch pops up and says, we can help you, we can be a supplement, they're just like, great, let's work together. It's the hostility comes in from the national level, the top level, where politicians are ideologically driven to attack what we're doing because we are jeopardizing the National Democratic Revolution. The National Democratic Revolution states that you have to centralize constantly more and more power in the hands of the state. And what AfriForum is doing is taking up responsibility away from the state, and that's a direct threat to the agenda.
How do you survive as a you're risking their sovereignty, so they have to have sovereignty one way or another. But if they're not strong enough to exert authority, then they just don't have sovereignties. But you're playing chicken with the state. How do you evade direct conflict from the force that supposedly rules your country?
So, what we employ there is the philosophy of asymmetric defense strategies. So, in nature, the best metaphor for it would be the porcupines in the Kruger National Park. So the Kruger National Park is the largest nature reserve in South Africa. It's got lions, leopards, elephants, everything. It's got the largest predators in Africa you can find there, but it's also got little porcupines and badgers. So why are porcupines and badgers flourishing in a nature reserve where there's lions and leopards that can eat them? Well, they've got very, very robust asymmetric defense strategies. So the badger survives with his thick skin, too thick for even the lion's teeth to go through. The porcupine survives by having massive spikes that can blind or even kill anything that tries to eat it. So that's the way in which we also survive, is we become, metaphorically speaking, inedible to the predators that are prowling around.
Yeah.
We have a network of 175 security structures all across the country. We have a well-organized database of 300,000 plus members all across the country. When it comes to uh, trying to do anything against AfriForum, it's genuinely a case of I'd like to see you try.
Okay.
We're not doing anything
So
illegal. We're
you're
not doing
confident that
anything where
you
we're
guys could
breaking the
hold your
law.
own against in a fight against the state, the federal.
Well, they've
I don't know
admitted as
federal.
such. I think it's a bit sensational to talk about a firefight between the states and us, rather being challenged by the state. Them trying to limit what we can do, I think, is
Yeah.
rather the battle that is going on. But I mean, they've admitted as such, as much. There was I was in attendance at a UN meeting a few years ago where, oh man, there's so much context that I have to get in here, but I'll try. It's such a fascinating case. So there's this other organization called the Urania Movement in South Africa. It's a Afrikaner only community that has been established in South Africa. Massive success. I'll definitely recommend you talk to a representative from there. A cultural community that are seeking increased autonomy for their community. And I was in this behind closed doors meeting at the UN, and the topic at the, what is it called? Um, the CERD, the Center for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I was there because AfriForum had handed in a report about the many race laws in South Africa, the discriminatory laws. So I was
Yeah.
invited to be a speaker at this behind closed doors event because the South African government had reached the point where they were being reviewed by CERD. And one of the UN representatives asked the South African top brass representatives, we heard about this community called Urania, this Afrikaner only exclusive community in your country. What are you going to do about it? And the ANC representative just simply said, there's nothing we can do. They're not breaking the law. They're not doing anything that gives us the opportunity to do anything to them. So in regards to I mean, that's just another example of that's AfriForum's position as well, is that we have made ourselves inedible with all these predators around us. They
Yeah.
really don't have the luxury of being able to just go full tyranny on this well-organized minority.
But
And
doesn't
that's the lesson that I think South Africa will teach, is that a organized minority is always able to resist against an unorganized majority that targets it.
is am I misreading that question, that exchange that you just told me? That question, what are you doing about this group, implies that the UN would side with the breaking up or the disbanding of the Afrikaners autonomy.
Well, that is implied in the question, is that
Yeah.
why are you not disbanding this exclusive community? Yes.
Yeah. Instead of why are you oppressing these people to such an extent that they need to form a ethnically homogenous resistance group. So the UN cares
Yeah.
less about you guys than they do about the multicultural project of South Africa, which is openly oppressing you.
Yeah, well, the South African government is not secret. It's no secret. You can find all the you can find all the laws that they discriminate on
Yeah.
their books. So
And the
it's not
UN doesn't
something
care
that you
about
have
those
to.
books. It cares about you guys. It cares about white, I guess, like Afrikaner, like white is the wrong word, but white solidarity or Afrikaner But if there was a
Yeah,
black
well, it's,
group that was doing the same thing, they wouldn't care, right? I'm just saying that there's
yeah.
an asymmetry from the top, and not just the top of your country, but the supposed top of the world.
Yes, but I think there's also another aspect here in regards to the question of, but what if the state starts targeting you even more, tries to take what you have or destroy what you have? Well, the short answer is, well, then you defend it, and the longer
Yeah,
answer is, when it comes to particularly that scenario, as Flip Base, the head of the Solidarity Movement, always says, you have to try, because if you don't, the only bigger risk than not than trying anything is to do nothing at all, and not doing anything at all because you're afraid it's going to be taken away from you or destroyed. In
yeah,
that case, defeat is certain.
yeah,
So doing what we're doing is a big risk. It could all be destroyed. It could all be
yeah.
taken away, but it's less
You're
of a risk
trying.
than doing nothing because then you're already defeated.
Well, I don't want to look into your playbook, so pardon the question,
Mm,
but at some point, would
sure.
you end up refusing to pay taxes? If you just delegitimize the state's authority and say you have no right to my money, because you're
Mm,
using my money against me, so therefore it's
mm, mm.
is that like
So in
that's
that
the
regard,
eventual?
yeah, so in that regard, before that conversation can really be had, a lot more still needs to be done in the on the self-management side, or in Afrikaans you'd call it self-bestuur. So what I mean by that is you have to build up a lot more capacity to be able to do these things yourselves and prove you can do these things yourself before you can have the conversation about, but now I want to pay less taxes. The best example, again, of this principle comes from that community that I mentioned, Urania. So what happened there was in the year 2000, so Urania already exists for about 10 years in 2000. In 2000, the government mandates that the entirety of the country needs to be administered under, needs to fall under some form of municipality, which means Urania will have to fall under the closest municipality to them, which is Tembelihle municipality in Hopetown, which means they will come under ANC administration. The ANC will then do all their services, and the ANC bureaucrats will be in control of what happens in their town. So they go to court and they win the court case so that they are allowed to do their own services, and the ANC run municipality is not going to handle the services. And the court judgment hinges on one particular very important detail, which I think is applicable on the bigger scale as well. The court looked at what the Iranians had been doing for the past 10 years. They'd been doing everything themselves already without any state assistance. And the court said, but they were already doing this themselves. Why they asked the government, why would you want to now expend more tax money to do things for a town that's already doing everything themselves, and saying they don't want you to do this for them? They are more than happy to do it all themselves for free without using your taxpayer money. And Irania won that court case because they had already created a reality on the
Yeah,
ground,
yeah,
which then only later got the de jure recognition. So de facto reality preceded de jure reality,
okay,
the de
yeah,
jure being the legal reality. The
yeah,
de facto, the real reality, the reality on the ground, had to happen first. So
yeah,
when it comes to get it back to that question regarding tax money, you have to first build that confidence, build that capacity, build that proof of ability that you can handle these types of
yeah.
responsibilities, and that
Like say
makes that
7 months
conversation all a
without a
lot more.
blackout or something like that, just to prove the.
Well, it's funny you should mention that town Urania goes without blackouts. They have total solar power. They have a massive solar battery, which means their town can go 12 hours if the power were to go off at the moment.
Yeah.
So they've
Well,
already
that
done
brings
that
up.
to a large extent.
I guess that brings up the international question,
Mm,
or I guess trade with beyond. If the Afrikaners are, I think that you guys would eventually need to establish trade with something outside, like I don't know, to get your solar power cells or
mm,
something like that. Something's rapidly changing, maybe in my country with the election of Donald Trump. He's really shaking up the international scene on a lot of levels. South
mm,
Africa was the paragon of progressive it was like the diadem of progressive utopia in the 90s. It was the poster child for this post-racial, post-historical moment. Everybody's going to come together. We're going to have rainbow flags everywhere. And then there's going to be massive amounts of flourishing. Because of that, it's failed, and South Africa might be the poster child of what happens after that progressive moment, after that liberal moment. And it seems like we're on the precipice of the post-World War II order up here in the north, with our relationships with Europe and Russia, and everything's in the mix-up. How does Trump shining the light on your situation, how does having the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, hail from your country and still have ties, either soft or deep, to your country, how does that shake up things for you guys? And how does that provide opportunity to rest from your current position, stability, and autonomy?
Right. So when it comes to what AfriForum and the wider solidarity movement are doing, it can be summed up in two Afrikaans terms, but I'll translate them. Unfortunately, they don't have, one of them doesn't have a direct translation, but I'll try my best. The one is, we are state-proofing our communities, staatsbestand, which means we are becoming as little as possible dependent on any form of government assistance, and then also becoming resistant and resilient to destructive government policy. That's still a work in progress. We are actively trying to increasingly become state-proof. And then secondly, we are actively trying to increase our ability to self-bestuur, to self-manage. It's a terrible translation, but there really isn't a better translation or accurate translation for it.
Yeah.
But there genuinely isn't. Like we've tried to look for a translation, it just doesn't work. Basically means increasingly taking your destiny into your own hands.
Yeah.
So when it comes to particularly the Afrikaner self-bestuur mission, there's still a lot to do. I mean, there's still a lot to build, education institution-wise, security structures-wise, but we're getting there. But when it comes to particularly the bigger picture in South Africa, the future of Afrikaners are tied to this place. And at the end of the day, our focus needs to be what is possible, not something far in the future that's maybe possible, but rather what you can often get stuck in daydreaming about a far off future and lose sight of what's currently being done or what can currently be done. So I think that's where we find ourselves today, is we're operating within the sphere of the possible, what is possible in the moment, and the chaos that we see around us in the world is a great thing, because chaos comes with opportunity. And we need the opportunities as Afrikaners, but because we're ready to take those opportunities. We've already have a lot of stress tested a lot of our ideas. We've taken a lot of it and brought it into the real world. So it's an exciting time, and we welcome, for example, the Trump administration's what do you call it? The pressure that they've put on the South African government. It's a fantastic thing, because this government is to a large extent, targeting minorities in this country through its legislation and through its rhetoric.
One last question, and then we'll wrap up, and you can plug where people can find more information and
Sure.
Connect with you. But what is it particular to the Afrikaner soul, that has, over the centuries that we very briefly kind of touched upon, like these about 400 years, about where under extreme duress and difficulties and not an easy time, not sliding into being victims. Like you guys, your story could be told as the story of an oppressed minority. I get zero indication in talking with you that you have any truck with that framing. It seems like you guys you're totally open about the hardships and the oppression that you face, but it doesn't seem like you guys are victims. What is it about your ethnos, your identity as a group that doesn't attach itself to victimhood?
Well, I would say when it comes to the Afrikaner view of the future, where we're building towards, it's always been based on the philosophy or driven by what we love rather than what we hate. So it's never been we're building towards a future by and the means that we will use is the means that we will use have always been rooted in the fact that we are doing this because we love our culture, we love our language, we our religion is very important and dear and cherished to us, and that's the thing. It almost is like that G.K. Chesterton quote of the soldier fighting not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him.
Hmm.
That's the Afrikaner story. It's always been out of a place of love, not out of a place of hatred or wanting to destroy anything. There has been a lot of there has been a lot of situations, war, economic depression, uh, political chaos that have put us in a position where it would be very easy just to blame a lot of scapegoats. But it's always been our political energy and cultural energy has always been directed at, but our main goal is to survive, and not just to survive, to thrive and to create a
Hmm.
future, not just for our children, but for our great grandchildren. And that's why the slogan from the solidarity movement is building to stay. We're was Boom
Hmm.
to Blay. But also we're
Hmm.
my colleague Flip Base sums it up very well. He says the politicians only think about the next election. We think about the next generation, and that's where we're building towards. So I think that would be the animating force behind what we're doing is the fact that it's always been about, and that's why I use that quote from Milan Kundera. It's always been a struggle to survive and find our own little place in the African sun, to carve out our own place, our own space to be able to be ourselves, not to oppress anyone, to not to become a great massive empire, just a place where we can be Afrikaners, where we can speak our language, where we can be free to be ourselves. And there, don't get me wrong, there have been many missteps on that path. There have been many mistakes. There have been many evil things that Afrikaners have done, just like any other people in human history. But at the core of our, as a people, at the core of our story, it's always been that striving for, but we just want a place where our children can be safe and where we have a bright view of the future. And in Africa is where we're rooted. Afrikaners as a culture, if we were a plant, we are a plant that only really survives in the African soil. So there's a massive Afrikaner diaspora, and we don't write them off as cowards or traitors or stupid or whatever
Hmm.
derogatory term you can use for them. But at the same time, we also understand that if Afrikaners don't have a future in Africa, we don't have a future at all.
Hmm.
So our culture was formed here, our language was formed here. We have to find a solution here. But at the same time, that massive diaspora that's out there, they've got an important role to play. They're still Afrikaners. They are still very much tied and to our culture. They love our culture as well. And they are doing massive work as well, spreading awareness out there in their host countries where they live and supporting us here in South Africa as well. So I think that's when it comes to the future, I think that's what makes Afrikaners very robust and non-depressed is the fact that we have a positive
Hmm.
future vision. We are building towards something that a lot of us believe in and building towards something, a collective goal. A lot of Afrikaners aren't united in this. Many Afrikaners are and organizations are taking different paths to get there. But at the end of the day, it's as the AfriForum message goes, we are fighting for a free, safe, and prosperous future for Afrikaners at the southern tip of Africa. And
Hmm.
when your when your mission is something positive like that, you will have the courage to go on. And when your mission is to try and get even, to get revenge, to
Yeah.
cut your enemy down to size, to get revenge for a slight in the past, that's the root or that's the perfect recipe for an inferiority complex. And
Yeah.
Afrikaners don't suffer from
And
an
resentment.
inferiority complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't subscribe to an ideology of revenge. That's
Hmm.
why we don't hold it against the Anglos of British descent that we encounter, we don't want to now get reparations from them, or have legislation that punishes them, or some type of revenge on them for what happened in the past. That's buried in the past. We've buried the hatchet and moved on. And relations between English white South Africans and Afrikaner South Africans are very good because of it. But because Afrikaners are not motivated by an ideology of revenge or getting back at anyone. We're motivated by an ideology of wanting to build something great and beautiful for our children and everyone else, all the other communities that we encounter here at the southern tip of Africa. No, in our world today, no people can be an island. We
Yeah.
are here in southern Africa with all these other different cultures around us. And that's why we also focus on building good relations between different cultural communities. Because at the end of the day, you can't just isolate yourself and cut yourself off from the cultural and demographic realities around you. You need to be building good relations. You need to be finding allies. You need friends. And at the end of the day, that's also a critical part of the recipe. So we can't just be building a future exclusively for where Afrikaners silo themselves off,
Yeah.
or where we are completely cut off from the world and the country and the region around us. We have to be actively engaging the different cultures and peoples that share this region of Africa with us.
Ernst van Zyl, thank you for this fascinating look into a place where history is very rich and still very much active. Where can people find you? What are they going to find when they get there?
Well, I try my best. As I said, it's one of the greatest stories that can be told, and to condense it down into 2 hours is a major challenge. And also, there's so many complexities to it as well. But as I said, I try my best. Before I plug some of my places where people can find me, people can just remember my rule of thumb is always all the facts that I listed in this conversation. Go read it up for yourself. Don't just believe what I say is gospel. Go research what I say. Hopefully, I got everything right, and that which I didn't get right, I will correct if pointed out to me. But that would be my closing encouragement to people, is to go see for yourself. Go do your research for yourself in regards to everything that I've said in this conversation. Where can people find me? Well, I post on social media on X under my brand or username Conscious Caracal, and I also post on YouTube under that name. Um, on YouTube, I do interviews particularly. I don't really do current events. So if you want like a deep dive analysis of the Zelensky versus Trump
That's
meeting
the
and
we have enough of
that, you're not
that.
you're not going to find that on my channel. What I do on my channel is I have conversations with people that I think have something to say, both from South Africa and abroad, but
Mhm.
on topics that are relevant simultaneously to South Africa and the Western world. So that's what I try to achieve with all my conversations on my channel, is to talk about topics that are relevant to both the Western world and South Africa, and to have conversations that will be relevant in 2, 3, or 5 years as well. I always strive that if you listen to one of my conversations that I have on my channel in 10 years, it will not be just an indecipherable
Mm.
referencing of things happening in the present. It will hopefully be as relevant as possible,
Yeah, we
even
all seek
at
the
that
evergreen
time.
podcast for sure.
That's the dream. And if you want to support state-proof solutions in South Africa, you can become a member of AfriForum. I will give a link to Benjamin that he can put in the description if he so chooses, where you can click to go support AfriForum either by becoming a member or by making a once-off donation. My YouTube channel is not monetized, so you can, if you really want to give someone money, you can donate it to an organization that does good work, rather than just the individual that does YouTube for fun.
Mm. Your second channel, is that it? That's in Afrikaner. I was looking through your videos, and
So
what
I've
is
got
your
a
is that Dutch and or Dutch with other things in it?
so Afrikaans is a language on its own. It's
Afrikaans.
the detractors of Afrikaans always say, "Oh, it's just a dialect." No, it's a full language on its own, with its own dictionaries, own grammatical rules, and own spelling. And it is one of its main influences is Dutch, but it's not a dialect of Dutch. So that's why many times during this conversation, you will pick up little pauses. actively translating in my head as I'm
You're very
speaking. My
good
first language is not English.
for your second language. This
No,
is very crisp
thank
and
you very
clear.
much. Maybe that it helps that my mother has some English influence in her family,
Hmm.
but maybe that played a role. But yeah, so my second channel is called In Alle Erns. It's my Afrikaans channel, and there I cover all the same topics that I do on my English channel, but for an Afrikaans audience. And I also cover some topics that are exclusively relevant to the Afrikaner zeitgeist. You know what's happening now is in Afrikaans we have a joke where we say, "My English is running out." When you've reached a point of a conversation where your translation function just literally starts
Yeah,
sputtering and
yeah.
stopping, I'm reaching that point now where my
Yeah.
English is
Yeah.
running
Well,
out.
that's a good place to point it. Thank you very much, Ernst, for your evening. I learned
Mm.
so much, and people need to check out your work. And good
Mm.
luck to you. And I hope to explore more about your country in the coming weeks. I have a couple other
Mm.
interviews in the pipeline. So,
Fantastic. Well, Benjamin, thank you very much for your time as well and for the platform. And as I said, I can only try my best to condense and explain this
yeah,
incredibly complex but also fascinating part of the world, a part of the world that I love deeply and that I can never leave.
excellent. Thank you.